if there was ever a time where it's kind of a crossroads or a signpost on the road, would be the Transfiguration. Because up to this point, they've been, he's been preparing them, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, where he had told Peter and the rest of the disciples that he was going to be betrayed, that he was going to die, that he was going to rise from the dead. He's been preparing them for what is to come. And the Transfiguration, when they go up onto the mountain, is really the time when they change their focus from journeying this way, and then they turn and they head south to Jerusalem. Matthew chapter 17 is where we're at. But last week we looked at Jesus and how Jesus asked his disciples that all-important question. And that was, who do you say I am? Who do you say I am? And Peter, of course, declared to that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You see, Jesus knows, as I said, that this is the time. That things are about to change. That he is to head to Jerusalem. He knows what lies ahead. And of course he was wondering, does anybody get it? Do the people who have been traveling with me for the last 3 years, do they understand who I am? He's been pouring his time, his life into these 12 men. And he needed to know that they understood. Peter's declaration, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, it shows that they understood, that they got it, that they caught a glimpse of his divinity. They understood, but just like a thick man, if you're a man, you know you're thick, okay? Sometimes you don't get things, and it takes a little while. Just like these 12 guys, they were thick men. They didn't completely understand, but they would soon enough. And as we picked up here in Matthew 17, it's about 6 days after this that he had asked that question. And Jesus takes the inner circle, the three closest to him, James, John, and Peter, and he goes up on a high mountain. And in Luke's gospel it says that he went up there to pray, to refocus, to get a proper orientation, to get a word from the Father. I find personally that prayer is one of the greatest ways that I prepare my heart and my soul and my body for a new day. To keep me in tune with God. To keep me in his presence. To prepare my heart for whatever might lie ahead. I mean, when we wake up in the morning, we have no idea what's going to take place, do we? None at all. We see, we put our plans into place. You might have a calendar and you might think, well, I'm going to do this today, I'm going to do this and this, and then you get a flat tire or something happens, or it doesn't happen the way that you think it's going to happen. I find for me that prayer at the beginning of the day prepares me for whatever might come. It gives me the right perspective. It prepares the soil of my heart for God to sow whatever it is that he wants to do in that day. And Jesus brings these 3 disciples up the mountain to pray, to be with them, to prepare them for what was coming in the next few weeks. A couple of years ago, Benjamin and I went on a mission trip to Toronto. And there was 8 of us all together in the team that went. And one of the things that, as one of the leaders of the group, I had encouraged them all to do was I sent out a daily prayer. It was just a prayer for them to pray, to read, to prepare their hearts, their minds for what was going to come, but also to prepare the people in Toronto for us to come, to minister amongst them. to let nothing keep us from what God wanted to do in us and through us during that time. I believe this is one of the reasons why Jesus went up the mountain to pray, was to gain that focus, that reorientation, to gain what he needed for what was to come. And as he was praying, something happened. His appearance changed. And it says that his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. He was pretty bright. It almost reminded me of when Moses used to meet God face to face up on the mountain, and then he'd come down and the people would say, "Moses, please put something over your face. You're glowing." You know, that's exactly, in one sense, what happened to Christ. His glory was revealed. What he used to be, the original glory that he had when it was Father, Son, and Holy Spirit before he came to this earth, was revealed. This was a glimpse, a brief glimpse for these three disciples to see the true glory of their King Jesus. And witnessing Jesus' glory, it made a deep impact on them. It impacted how they saw him. They now actually saw that he was indeed the Son of the living God that he had proclaimed 6 days before. He was revealed to them. And over 30 years later, Peter wrote in his second letter, in chapter 1, he said, "For we are not making up clever stories when we told you about the powerful coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We saw his majestic splendor with our own eyes. And when he received honor and glory from God the Father, the voice from the majestic glory of God said to him, 'This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" He says this 30 years later, that event was etched in his mind. He says, "We ourselves heard that voice from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain." See, these words, "This is my Son whom I love, with him I am well pleased," these words were from the Father, and they revealed to these three disciples a little bit of interesting stuff about Jesus. This is my Son. He's no ordinary man. This is my Son. I love him, and I'm pleased with him. See, Jesus' glory, it physically revealed to these three men who went with him up on the mountain to pray, the majestic, awesome, and holiness of Jesus. And then we see the appearance of two witnesses, Moses and Elijah. And John MacArthur says about Moses and Elijah, he says, "As no others, Moses and Elijah represented the Old Testament, the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. As no others, they could give human testimony to Christ's divine majesty and glory." And he says, by their presence together, they affirmed, in effect, that this is the one of whom we testified, we wrote about, we spoke about, the one in whose power we ministered, and the one in whom everything we said and did has meaning. Everything we spoke, accomplished, and hoped for was fulfilled in him. These two came as witnesses. How many people do you need when you get married for witnesses? 2. Why is it 2? Do you know why it would be 2 people instead of just 1? Because then you have the combined testimony of such of 2 people. That's why in the Old Testament it said that you needed to have 2 witnesses, because 1 could lie, but 2, if they saw, were attesting to the same thing, then they were able to attest. And so the two witnesses, Moses and Elijah, were sent. These two great saints were talking with Jesus. And in Luke's Gospel, it says that they were talking to him about his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. They weren't simply just standing there. Yep, we see you. You're there. You're bright as light. We're, here as witnesses. No, they were actually preparing him, trying to get things in place. They were talking with him as a friend, face to face, about his departure, about his sacrifice, about the objective and the work that his earthly ministry would accomplish, about his departure. And if you look at that word departure, it actually is another word for Exodus. Just as Moses, representative of the law, brought the Israelite people out of bondage of slavery, Jesus, they were preparing him to bring we who are here and those through time out of the bondage to what? Sin. To pay for that. And pay for what we could not pay for ourselves. And this was accomplished, as we know, a few weeks later in Jerusalem. But Jesus' physical appearance revealed his glory. The two witnesses also revealed the glory of the Father. And then it says that Peter, he says, what? Oh, Lord, it's good for us to be here. This is great. I'm enjoying this immensely. I would not want to be anywhere else. How about we set up a few tents for y'all, and we'll just camp here, and we'll stay here for a while. Have you ever had an experience in your life that you didn't want to end? I would want to stay here for a good long time. I'm sure we've all had those types of experiences. And you always remember those experiences as well. Peter wanted to camp out. He doesn't want it to end. He wanted to stay. However, a cloud envelops Jesus and Moses and Elijah. God's very presence came down. The Father appears to his Son, to father his Son, to give him what he needs for the journey ahead. And it says that a voice came and said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." If we turn back to the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, chapter 3, Jesus is beginning his public ministry. Jesus has gone down into the waters. The dove has come down and set upon him. John the Baptist has just baptized him. And the Father speaks. And what the Father says to Jesus as he's beginning his earthly ministry is, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We've all wanted to have words of affirmation from our own fathers. Maybe you've had some of those words. Maybe you haven't. I'm going to tell you two stories about my own dad, about words of affirmation. I was at the front door one day with my sister. I was getting ready to leave, and I said, "I love you, Dad." And my dad said, "Yeah, I know, boy." And my sister got kind of indignant at him. She says, "Didn't you just hear what he said?" "Yeah, I heard what he said. He told me that he loves me." "Well, aren't you going to tell him that you love him?" "I did." "I know." That was his word. When I first started to preach, I was in New Harbor, and Dad and Mom came down to hear me. And it would be it was when I was in Jordan Falls, so that would be like 7 or 8 years later. I invited them to come to church again he came in and he said, it's been a little while since I heard you, boy. You've improved a little. Words of affirmation. We've all wanted them from our Father, to hear words of maybe pride or words of just affirmation of the people that we have become. Here Jesus is. He's getting ready to, back in chapter 3, to do his earthly ministry, and he receives amazing words. This is my son. This is the boy who came from me. I love him. How many of us want to hear those words? My Father never told me that he loved me like that. I love you. But he said it in many other ways. How many of us would love to hear that? Whom I love. With him I am well pleased. My dad was a very Victorian kind of guy. His mother was very Victorian, which means that they didn't hug, they didn't kiss, they didn't say it. Probably within the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years of his life, one of the things I would do is I would give him a hug. And the first time I gave him a hug, it was pretty stiff. You know, he didn't know what to do with it. But it was interesting to see that through the years, how I could see it. He was waiting for it. He was expecting that hug. And in that, I could see that, indeed, my dad was well pleased. My Uncle Bob said to me when I was graduating from seminary, he said, this is my dad's brother, he said, Don, remember this one thing. Big church, big bucks. And my dad looked at him and he said, Bob, you're wasting your time. Boy doesn't care about money. Yeah. So this bright cloud, it envelops Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And out of this comes the voice. Again, this is my son. Let that sink in for a second. This is my son, whom I love. With him, I am well pleased. Listen, he says. Listen to him. What a message to get from God the Father. What a message to hear. What a message to grant to him the undergirding strength that he needs for the weeks ahead. What a message to receive for the challenges that are yet ahead of him. And what a message for us today as well. Because if you think about that, this is my son. Who is it that we come to worship? We come to worship Father, Son, and Spirit. We come to worship the triune God in his fullness. This is my son, whom I love. Isn't that intimate fellowship? Isn't that what we desire in our own hearts, is to have fellowship with God, to feel his love, his acceptance, his forgiveness, but also to be able to be people of that love as well, to give it away. With him I am well pleased. Everything that he's done up to this point has been what? Perfect. He has followed what I've given to him. I am well pleased with him. You've gotten pretty good, boy. My dad has been pleased. What he did, how he lived. And isn't that for us? Wouldn't we love to hear those words? Well done, thy good and faithful servant. Listen to him. He's telling these three boys, Peter, James, and John, listen to him. You've been with him for these last 3 years. Continue to listen to him. These next couple weeks, he's going to be sharing a lot of stuff with you. Listen to him. Not only listen to him and allow it to dissipate out, listen, let it affect you as you grow in him, as you walk with him. And then Jesus, they fell face down to the ground when they heard this, terrified. And Jesus came to them and he said, "Get up. Don't be afraid." They looked up and what happened? Well, he's no longer glowing like lightning. He's back to day-to-day Jesus. And they start coming down from the mountain. Didn't have the opportunity to set up the tents because the experience is already done. They're walking down the mountain and Jesus says to them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." When I'm raised from the dead, then you need to go. And you need to tell what you've just experienced. You need to go and to tell what you're going to experience. You need to go and tell what is going to happen. The Father's words were, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." This morning we're going to come to the table in communion to remember, to commit our lives to him, to give ourselves to him. But before we do, we've got a privilege of having some folks joining us in membership. We've already voted you in. It's all taken care of that way.